Hi, and welcome to the Brookdale Visiting Writer Series show. My name is Suzanne Parker. I direct the creative writing program here at Brookdale, where I'm part of the English faculty. Today, I'm very excited to be talking to Tiphanie Yanique, whose new short story collection is called How to Escape from a Leper Colony. She is part of the New School faculty, and as well as being a fiction writer, is also a poet. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Tiphanie. I just wanted to start off by asking, kind of when and how did you come to writing?
Well, I think writers often make up really fascinating stories about when they came to writing, but and I've made up many fascinating ones myself over time. But since we're on TV and people may report it, I'll tell the truth. So the truth is that my first real storyteller, my first real relationship with narrative was through my grandmother. Oh. And I grew up with my grandparents, and my grandmother was a storyteller. She was a children's librarian. So telling stories was what she did as a children's librarian. And we just had stories in the house all the time. And I really just fell in love with telling stories. And we would tell stories back and forth. It was kind of how the family did things. And that was a really very early and important part of me learning to be a writer and wanting to work with language on the page, but also work with language, particularly in narrative.
That's interesting, though, because you're a poet as well, and some of your first work published was poetry, correct?
That is correct. I was a poet first, and I still think of myself as a poet first. I went to graduate school in fiction because it wasn't my stronger genre, and I wanted to get better at it. And as happens, it was my formative time, and I was so focused, and I had all this time to write and to read and to learn. And so I think eventually my fiction has gone further than my poetry. But I'm a poet first, and I hope that that's impacted the stories to some extent and made the stories lyric, and has given me attention to language and to where sentences end and where paragraph ends. That's beyond just what you learn in 5th grade or 10th grade, but is in some way influenced by the way that lines break in poems and the way that stanzas break in poems. So that's something that I hope is very much there in the work still. And of course, I continue to write poetry also.
You do, yeah.
But that's a slower process for me, and because I didn't go to school for it, it's one that I take much more time and care with because I have to be my own teacher. So I'm excited about my poetry, but it's something I'm very careful about.
Well, I'm interested in actually what you said about being aware of the sentence, because one of the things, as a poet myself, I really appreciate a fiction writer who really is paying attention to at a word level. And actually, that works really nicely in Leper Colony. But I wonder, how do you know if you're writing a poem or if you're writing a short story? Like, how are those processes different for you? Like, what's emotion or story or thing sparks one or the other?
For right now, and this is just my answer today, or my answer this year, but when I want to write about a community, or when I want to write about things that are important, I think, beyond myself, things that have cultural resonance, things that have spiritual resonance or historical resonance, I tend to write towards narrative, towards story.
Why?
I think it's because when I want to write about things that are culture and community, I think of another human being. I think of myself maybe as a puppeteer who has lots of voices around me, and I want to get them all talking. When I want to write things that are much more personal and that feel much more selfish, I tend to go towards poetry. Now, I don't think poetry is a more personal form necessarily than it is than fiction is, but for me it is. And when I want to write things that feel very self-serving, those things tend to come out in poems. But that's just a weird peculiarity that I have. But that means that I don't write narrative poetry, and I also don't even get it. I don't really get narrative poetry, and I don't write it because when I think of a story, I think of characters, and I think of voices, and I think of scene, and I begin to build a house the minute I start thinking of community and I start thinking of character.
So is that what begins your stories for you? Is a character?
I think often it is character. I really love people. I think people are really strange and awesome. And I like writing about people, and I'm pretty nosy, and I'm pretty friendly. And I get a lot of my stories from snooping on people and stealing stories from people I love or people who I'm curious about. So I think, though, that even the stories that I like to read are all character-based. before I became an English major as an undergrad, I was a psychology major. And I feel like my psychology classes were as useful as my fiction classes for helping me understand story writing, because it helped me understand human beings, which helped me write better characters.
Do you ever feel like you want to analyze your characters?
All the time. Yeah, I mean, I think actually that's what I'm doing. I think a lot of what at least in what I think I'm doing is breaking them apart the way a therapist might. But they don't know that this is happening to them, that I'm inside their heads and cracking them open. But I hope the reader feels like they're spine a little bit on a therapy session, because I feel like that's what I'm doing to some extent.
Well, that's really interesting that poetry sort of uses something and comes from a very different place and isn't even narrative in a way.
No, not for me anyway. Yeah. And if my characters are on the couch in fiction, I think I'm on my own couch in poetry.
I wonder, for your new book, which How to Escape from a Leper Colony, which has gotten wonderful reviews and much critical acclaim, which it should. Could you describe it for somebody who may not be familiar with it?
Well, How to Escape from a Leper Colony is a collection of stories, which makes it a little difficult to describe.
That's why I asked you to do it.
Yeah. And there's probably the one unifying thing that the collection has is epitomized in the epigraph. And the epigraph goes, "Lead us to those we are waiting for, those who are waiting for us." And that's from a prayer to the patron saint of lovers and travelers. And that idea of desiring place and desiring love, and finding that in the lover, which could be a place and a person, is kind of what my collection is really about. So it's about people who are longing for home, trying to figure out what home is, find themselves in places where they are foreign, where they are other, or where they are not, but they still feel as though they are. And trying to figure out for themselves what it means to be fully human as characters. So that idea of them searching for what they are longing for, and also searching for the thing that longs for them, is really what the collection is all about. But that ends up being manifested in tons of different ways. So I have one character who's a drug dealer and falls in love with a college girl. I have one 14-year-old who finds out that she has leprosy and gets sent to a leprosarium in Trinidad. I have a character who is a runner and gets this bizarre disease, canoe sickness, that makes it hard for him to run. And so I have characters
Did you make that one up, the canoe sickness?
There's a real disease called Kayak Sickness.
Really?
Now, I'm sure it's all psychological. It's a disease of the mind that happens to Inuits in Alaska. And I just read a strange article about it and found it really fascinating. But also found that for the Alaskans, they're hunting seal, and they're in kayaks, and for them, it's their livelihood. It's they need to get this food, and so they can take it back home to their families.
Sure.
And to be in the kayak in the cold, and then suddenly realize that that the seal comes and goes, and you can't even move to accomplish dinner for the week, just seemed like such a devastating thing, and it also sounded like a metaphor for the condition of oppressed people, maybe all over the world. And so I wanted to use it, but I don't know anything about Alaska. So I changed it to be a canoe and made it, instead of the Inuits, I made it the Caribs and the Arawaks in the Caribbean, which I know very well because that's where I'm from. So I just kind of, it's a sort of slightly made up.
Instead of a seal, is it a shark?
It's a shark.
Shark, yes.
Which is what the Carib and Arawak and Taino Indians of the Caribbean, they did hunt shark, among many other sea creatures. But yeah.
Well, I wonder, if, for example, even in How to Escape from a Leper Colony, you were saying before a lot of material comes to you through eavesdropping. Like, where were you getting the ideas for the stories in this collection?
Well, calling it a poem is flattering me, so don't worry. Well, that first story, How to Escape from a Leper Colony, is based originally on pictures that a friend of mine brought back from a little island called Chakachakare. And on this island, which was evidenced by the pictures, there's still a leprosarium that has been abandoned, and it's not being taken care of by the government in any formal way. But the leprosarium itself still stands. The churches that were there still stand. The evidence of the nuns and the priests and the lepers are still there. In some cases, their medicines are still there.
Wow.
Their files are still there. Their beds, the cups that they drank out of, everything is still
just been
there.
deserted and
It's
left.
just been deserted. And I was fascinated by this. And apparently it's a place where boaties go sailing and stop by, but it's also thought to be haunted. So there's a whole weird relationship to this island. Trinis, who the island belongs to, belongs to Trinidad, Chacachacare, have one idea of the island, and then sailors who stop by have a different idea of the island, but nobody really has the truth of what happened. And I did a lot of research and couldn't find anything, and so I decided I would just make it up and figure out why, where did these people go and why did they leave the place with all their stuff behind? So I wrote the story to answer my own questions, my own curiosity.
And you have in the end of the story, well, I don't want to say what the end of the story is, but you do have this wonderful way that it resolves itself in this sort of beautiful, symbolic fashion.
Although I have a lot of folks who tell me, what happens? What happens? But I get that with my endings a lot. I'm not one who closes my stories with a bow tie. I'm much more interested in exploring them and allowing them to stay open so people can continue swimming in the stories in their mind.
Well, on that note, we are going to continue after break. I'm talking with Tiphanie Yanique. Please join us after break, and we will be right back.
I'm Karen Escobedo, Manager of Community Outreach for New Jersey Natural Gas, and I got my start at Brookdale.
To learn more about how to get your start at Brookdale, visit brookdalecc.edu.
Today, we gather to recognize the selfless decision of one of the most influential women of our time. The woman who, after having one too many drinks, chose not to drive home buzzed. Here today to honor Rachel is the family whose lives she spared.
Hi, it's Elmo.
And I'm Secretary Kathleen Sebelius.
Elmo and Secretary Sebelius are here to tell you how to stay healthy this flu season.
First, you learn to sneeze into the bend of your arm like this.
Oh, very good. Always wash your hands really well.
And remember to have a plan in case your child is too sick for school, so someone can stay home with them until they get better.
Stay healthy, America.
Hi, and welcome back to the Brookdale Visiting Writers Series show. My name's Suzanne Parker, and I am talking with Tiphanie Yanique, the author of How to Escape from a Leper Colony. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Before the break, you were talking about your endings and how they're kind of open-ended. Sometimes people want to know what happened. And just over break, we were talking about it. I thought it was really interesting. So can you kind of speak to kind of your endings and where you like to leave stories or where they naturally come to a conclusion?
I think endings are so difficult, especially for student writers. So I feel like what folks who might be watching this would love for me to say is, here is how I do it, X, Y, Z. But that would just be a lie and also be unfair because I don't think that it happens like that. I think for me it happens much more emotionally. It's much more based on what's happening symbolically for the character and what's happening emotionally for the character. And these are short stories. These are not the characters' entire lives. I want my readers to know that the characters continue. And whether they continue in a way that is difficult or painful, or whether they continue in a way that is hopeful and full of happiness, irregardless, I want my characters to continue. And so I don't tie up my stories with a bow at the end ever. I really want my characters to travel, to exit the story walking. And whether that
I
means
love that image. Nice. Yeah.
and whether that means walking, whether that means in some of my stories literally walking or swimming or driving or just emotionally on the move, I want it to be clear that I've created an entire world, but I've only given the reader, this little fraction of this world.
With my creative writing students, I often talk about that with short stories. I'm like, because so often I think the instinct is to write like a novel, but just really fast. It's like it's a scene. It's not the whole movie. It's just one quick scene.
Although, I think some of the best movies have come from short stories and not from novels.
That's true.
Because I think the short story a short story in a movie form happens in about the same time that you read a short story. Because a movie might be an hour and a half or 2 hours, which is how long you might have sat down with a short story, whereas a novel took you a couple of days to read. And I find that a lot of these movies that are based on novels tend to be junky and messy, and they don't ever know what to cut, and
then they cut the wrong thing.
Cut the wrong
Most people
thing, and then if you've read the book, you're like, that movie sucked. I love the book so much better. But often when you've read the story and then you watch the movie, it's really quite gratifying.
It's true, actually. It's a great point.
Yeah. So I think you can write complication and you can write breadth and width into a story. I think you can write community into a story. I'm one of those short story writers that writes fat, lushy short stories. They're not clean. They're not tight. They're juicy short stories. At least I hope they are. And so I think anything is kind of possible, but I still think that that the short story, may be different from the novel, ends on possibility.
I'm thinking of a couple of the stories in the collection, the International Shop of Coffins, and others where you're repeating from different points of view and different perspectives, the same critical incident or the same moment, which is not, your standard, nice, neat, beginning, middle, and end. So I guess I'm interested to know what your process is as you're writing a story.
Well, the story you're talking about, International Shop of Coffins, it's in 3 parts. And each of the stories, each part starts in the same place on the same day, where 3 characters are all in this coffin shop.
Which is this incredible space that you've created.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't exist. I did.
It should.
I made it up.
It was fabulous.
And what I do is for the first page and a half, I'm just setting the scene. But each time I set the scene, which is the same scene, I'm setting it with slightly different details that are relevant to the story that's about to be told. So it's really small, but at least in my mind, they're important still details. So the first person is the guy who owns the coffin shop. The next is his best friend, who's a priest, who comes and visits the coffin shop to spend time with his friend, the owner, but also to look at the coffins, which are really beautiful, beautiful coffins with great detail and almost like artistic pieces.
Sure.
And then the third story is from a girl who is shopping for coffins. She says she's shopping for an assignment for school, but in a way she's shopping because her mother has died, and in a way she's shopping maybe for herself. So I go and then I just tell their individual stories. Now, part of why I did that was I wanted to tell a story of a community, and I really wanted to display a kind of truth that I really believe, which is that there is no one version of any story in real life. When you and I leave this stage, we're gonna have 2 different versions of what happened. The cameramen will have a different version of what happened, and we could all tell a really interesting and varied version of events. The people who are watching on TV will have their versions, and I wanted to honor that. So that story actually was born of the structure, because I wanted to do something that made that explicit. That I explicitly want to say that community is really important and that different voices are vital to our understanding of anything.
How many times do you begin a story then with a clear sense of intention with it?
Sometimes that story structurally I had that clear structural intention, similar to the way a poet who writes a sonnet says, "I'm going to write a sonnet." So
it's hard to just fall into a sonnet.
Right, yeah. I would say it's probably impossible to fall into a sonnet, unless you're a sonneteer. So I thought I want to write this structure, and then I'm going to fill the structure in the way that a poet might figure out how to fill a sonnet. like a bowl that you pour your ideas and thoughts and hopefully wisdom into. But not all my stories start that way. One of the stories in the collection, which begins with a church burning down.
That's great.
It began with that line.
That was a chapbook, right?
Yeah,
As well?
originally it was a chapbook. It's the book. The story is called "The Saving Work," and it begins with the line that is, "A church is burning down," and that line is where that story began. And I stole that line. I mean, that's not a line to steal. It's a very kind of vague line, but the idea of that line came from a poem that I read by David Rivard.
Oh.
And I won't give away the poem because then it gives away the story. But the poem was so fascinating to me that I just kind of stuck with that line. And why is this church burning down? And just that line was in my head for like months. And then I had these characters, these two women who go to the same church, but who hate each other's guts. And I'm really fascinated by religion and how it tells us something about who we are as individuals and as a society. And so I just was kind of sticking with these women who are clearly hypocrites. They're supposed to be loving each other with God and all that, and yet they hate each other's guts. And then I thought, well, what if it's their church that's burning down? And so it came from a line, it came from language, and it came from character. And then I began to impose a structure, which was that the church and the women were happening separately. I wrote them in columns. So side by side on the same page, I wrote the scene of the church, and then I wrote all the stuff about the women. Eventually, I let go of that structure. The story is structured really differently. It goes back and forth in time and in place and in scene and in voice to some extent. But originally, it had this bizarre side-by-side structure. But that started with language and with character.
That's great. That's great. I know that in a blog that you have, you spoke about the book being a racial mash. Can you kind of expand on that?
Oh, this blog. I'm not a big internet person, so I don't really remember. I put that blog together when I didn't have a website, and it's been a while since I've even looked at it.
It's still there.
It's still there. Yeah, it never goes away. I'm sure there's a way to get it to go away, but it's fine. All those things that are on there were things that were true to me then and are probably still true to me now. So I think the book is a racial mash to some extent, but that wasn't something that I was doing in some kind of with radical intent. It felt very natural to me to write, especially Caribbean characters of all races. That was true to my experience. I went to a very diverse school. There were 20-something of us who graduated, and we were from every part of the world imaginable. It was really diverse, ethnically, racially, religiously, and I just wanted to write that in my collection, which is the real benefit of a collection, is that you can have main characters who are radically different from each other. And so as a whole, you can end up really having a diverse voice of a diverse community. So that just felt very true to me. But in my own family life, I mean, religion is really complicated. I had an uncle who's Rastafari. I have an aunt who's Muslim. I have my grandparents were Catholic. My mom is Protestant. I have an aunt who's evangelical. Like we are everything you could imagine, and we're all family. And I just found that felt very true to me, and so it was very easy for me to write that into my stories.
Well, we only have a couple minutes left, but I wanted to ask what you're working on now.
I'm working on a novel. It's called Land of Love and Drowning, and it's a story that's based very loosely on my grandmother and my aunt, who were such fascinating human beings, and they in my novel they have the power to make any man fall in love with them.
Like an actual magical power?
Yep, they do.
That's useful.
And I think really, I actually think that my grandmother and my aunt probably really had this power. So it's based on them and their lives, and they were these women who had been raised originally very wealthy, and then the family had lost all the money, and we moved into a really rough, poor neighborhood. And so I grew up in a rough neighborhood in the Virgin Islands, but I had a grandmother who taught me how to hold a cup of tea with the right, in the right way. So it's a very peculiar upbringing, and I wanted to write that into a novel. I'm also working on a collection of poems called Wife,
Great.
Which is about the strange thing that humans do, get married.
Take on new roles.
Yeah.
Is there a date that those will be coming out soon that we can look for?
No, I'm working on them, and I'm very lucky to have publishers who are excited to receive them, but are not pushing me to to have them happen tomorrow.
Well, it has been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.
On the show. We'll have to have you back when Wife and In the Land of
Love and Drowning
comes out.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with Tiphanie Yanique, the author of How to Escape from a Leper Colony, and this has been the Brookdale Visiting Writers Series show. My name is Suzanne Parker. Please do join us again.